Some weapons were feared because they were powerful, others because they were loud. But in the Pacific War, there was one weapon that terrified soldiers long before it ever touched them. American troops carried it on their backs, walking slowly through mud, smoke, and silence. From a distance, it didn't look advanced. No massive barrel, no roaring engine, just a figure moving forward, and a sound that meant there was nowhere left to hide. Veterans would later describe moments when entire defensive positions fell quiet, not after an explosion, but after a single burst of flame echoed through the jungle. Why did trained Japanese soldiers, hardened by years of brutal fighting, sometimes abandon fortified caves at the mere presence of this simple weapon? To understand that fear, you first have to step into the battlefield where fire changed the rules of war, and where survival often depended on who broke psychologically first. The war in the Pacific was unlike anything American soldiers had faced before. This was not open land, not cities, not clear front lines. It was jungle, thick, suffocating jungle, islands carved by volcanic rock, where every step forward felt like stepping into the unknown. Heat pressed down constantly, and visibility could disappear within a few meters. Japanese forces did not fight from trenches in the open. Instead, they vanished into the terrain. Hills were hollowed out. Mountains were turned into networks of caves. What looked like solid ground could suddenly open with rifle fire from unseen positions. Every island became a fortress. Every bunker was connected to another. And every cave was designed to be held to the last man. For American troops trying to advance, this created a nightmare. Enemy soldiers could not be easily seen, could not be easily reached, and almost never surrendered. Attacks that seemed successful would stall instantly, stopped by resistance coming from underground. The battlefield felt endless, and victory, at times, felt impossible. American units pushed forward again and again, moving uphill under heavy fire, clearing one position at a time. Grenades were thrown into openings. Rifle squads rushed bunker entrances. Sometimes flameless explosions echoed through the rock, followed by silence that felt like progress. But the caves kept fighting back. A bunker that looked destroyed would suddenly come alive hours later. Hidden tunnels allowed defenders to disappear, reposition, and strike from another angle. Soldiers described the frustration of securing ground during the day, only to face the same resistance by nightfall. Every victory felt temporary. Every advance came at a cost. Traditional tactics began to fail against an enemy that refused to leave its underground world. Artillery could collapse entrances, but it rarely reached the defenders buried deeper inside. Machine guns dominated open ground, but they could not force someone out of a sealed cave. Therefore, commanders realized something had to change. They didn't just need more firepower. They needed a way to reach into the darkness itself, a method that could force an enemy to abandon positions that bullets and explosives couldn't truly clear. And that realization would lead to the arrival of a weapon unlike anything most soldiers had ever seen on a battlefield. Then, something new began to appear at the front lines. Not a tank rolling through the jungle, not an aircraft roaring overhead, just a single soldier stepping forward, carrying a heavy metal pack strapped tightly to his back, moving slower than the rest of the unit. At first glance, it didn't look like a weapon that could change anything. It looked vulnerable, exposed, almost fragile compared to the chaos surrounding it. But when these operators moved into position, everything around them shifted. rifle fire would suddenly pause. Defenders who had remained hidden for hours reacted differently, sometimes retreating deeper into tunnels, sometimes firing wildly before disappearing into the darkness. The presence of this new tool created tension even before it was used. American troops quickly understood that this wasn't just another piece of equipment. It was a response to the impossible battlefield they had been fighting in, a way to reach places where explosions had failed and where fear could travel farther than any bullet. And as more units began to deploy it, the war inside the caves was about to change forever. The first time many American units saw the weapon used in combat, it didn't feel like a decisive moment. It felt uncertain. Operators had to move dangerously close to cave entrances, often protected only by a few riflemen covering their advance. Every step forward drew enemy fire, and the weight on their backs made retreat slow and difficult. In one early assault, a squad spent hours trying to silence a fortified position hidden behind jagged, volcanic rock. Grenades rolled inside, and nothing happened. The defenders stayed silent, waiting. Then a flamethrower operator crawled forward through the dirt, stopping just a few meters from the opening. When a burst of fire surged into the darkness, the reaction was immediate. Shouting, movement, and sudden chaos from within the tunnel. But not every attempt went smoothly. Sometimes, defenders fired relentlessly at the operator, understanding the threat he posed. American soldiers learned quickly that protecting that single figure became the priority of the entire team. If he fell, the assault often stalled again. Other moments were quieter, almost unsettling. There were cases where no shots were fired at all. A short burst of flame would disappear into a cave, followed by silence, and then figures emerging with their hands raised, choosing surrender over what waited inside. These early encounters revealed something unexpected. The weapon wasn't just changing how battles were fought. It was changing how soldiers reacted before the fight even began. And as word spread across the islands, both sides started to understand that this new presence on the battlefield carried a psychological weight far greater than its simple design suggested. Before we move deeper into the psychological side of these battles, take a moment to subscribe if you enjoy historical stories told through the human experience of war. It helps the channel grow, and it allows more of these untold moments to be remembered. As the weapon appeared more often across the islands, something began to change long before the first burst of flame. Soldiers noticed that the atmosphere around a cave would shift the moment an operator stepped forward. The battlefield grew tense. Movement slowed. Even the jungle seemed to hold its breath. At a distance, the weapon looked simple, almost crude compared to artillery or aircraft. But inside confined tunnels, its presence meant something entirely different. The narrow spaces amplified heat, smoke, and sound, turning every hidden chamber into a place where escape felt uncertain. Defenders who had resisted hours of bombardment suddenly faced a threat that moved with intention, step by step, toward their position. American troops described the moment before deployment as strangely quiet. Riflemen covered the advance, watching for any sign of movement. While the operator aimed into darkness no one else could reach. However, it wasn't always the flames themselves that created fear. Sometimes it was the anticipation, the knowledge of what was about to happen, that broke resistance before a single trigger was pulled. Inside the caves, tension built differently. Japanese soldiers had trained to endure bombardment and close combat, but the psychological pressure of fire spreading through confined spaces forced decisions that traditional weapons rarely did. Some retreated deeper underground, abandoning carefully prepared positions. Others fired blindly, revealing locations that had stayed hidden for days. This was the turning point. The weapon was no longer just a tool to clear obstacles. It became a symbol, a signal that the battle had shifted from endurance to survival. And with every encounter, the fear surrounding it grew stronger, shaping the behavior of both attackers and defenders long before the flames ever appeared. But the same weapon that changed the battlefield also turned its operators into the most dangerous targets on it. Enemy soldiers quickly learned to recognize the silhouette, the metal tanks, the slow and deliberate movement, the way entire squads formed around a single figure. The moment a flamethrower appeared, gunfire intensified. Snipers shifted their aim. Hidden positions that had remained silent suddenly revealed themselves, determined to stop the operator before he reached effective range. Advancing with the weapon meant stepping closer to danger than anyone else in the unit. There was no safe distance, no protective armor strong enough to remove the risk. One well-placed shot could disable the operator or ignite the fuel he carried, turning the weapon into a deadly burden rather than an advantage. Some assaults ended before they truly began. Operators were forced to retreat under heavy fire, leaving positions uncleared and squads exposed once again to enemies hidden beneath the earth. In those moments, the weapon felt less like a solution and more like a gamble. The psychological weight shifted to both sides. American troops knew they depended on the flamethrower to break impossible defenses, but they also understood the cost of bringing it forward. Every step toward a cave entrance carried the possibility of sudden loss. For a brief period, it seemed as if the very tool meant to overcome fear had created a new kind of vulnerability, a reminder that in the Pacific, even the weapons designed to end the stalemate could become a curse for the soldiers forced to carry them. It was only after countless encounters that the true nature of the weapon became clear. It wasn't feared because it was the most powerful tool on the battlefield. Larger explosions existed. Deadlier weapons were everywhere, but none of them worked the same way. The flamethrower didn't just attack the body, it confronted the mind. Inside a sealed cave, there was no distance to hide behind, no cover to absorb the threat. Fire consumed air, filled space with choking smoke, and erased the sense of time. In those moments, resistance stopped being a matter of discipline or training. It became a question of survival. For defenders, the choice was immediate and brutal. Stay and face an unseen force spreading through confined darkness, or abandon positions that had been prepared for months. Many realized that holding ground no longer meant honor or victory. It meant being trapped with no escape. That was the weapon's true power. It broke the certainty that underground fortifications provided. It shattered the belief that caves were safe, and once that belief was gone, entire defensive systems began to collapse, not because they were destroyed, but because the will to remain inside them disappeared. The realization didn't stay theoretical for long. It reshaped how assaults unfolded across some of the most brutal battlefields in the Pacific. On islands like Iwo Jima, where volcanic rock hid entire networks beneath the surface, American units began advancing with a different rhythm. Riflemen moved first, securing narrow paths through ash and shattered terrain, while flamethrower operators followed close behind. Instead of endless firefights against invisible enemies, cave entrances were approached with a new sense of purpose. Resistance that once lasted for hours sometimes collapsed in moments, not because every position was destroyed, but because defenders understood what was coming next. The same pattern appeared again during Okinawa. Hills that had stalled previous advances were gradually cleared as coordinated teams pushed forward, sealing tunnels and forcing movement within underground systems. Each engagement felt less like a chaotic assault and more like a psychological siege, where the presence of fire changed decisions before bullets ever landed. Caves that had once seemed untouchable were abandoned. Fortified positions, built over months, lost their strategic value once the certainty of safety disappeared. Soldiers described entire sections of terrain falling quiet after a single advance, the jungle returning to an uneasy silence where constant gunfire had once echoed. These outcomes were not sudden miracles. They were the direct consequence of a shift in how fear operated on the battlefield, a change that turned impossible defenses into fragile ones and transformed the war inside the caves into something far more unpredictable. When the battles finally faded into history, the weapon itself remained surprisingly simple. No complex machinery, no advanced targeting systems, just a tool carried by ordinary soldiers walking into extraordinary danger. Yet its legacy was never measured by technology. It was measured by the way it changed human behavior on the battlefield. Long after the smoke cleared from places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, veterans remembered how the mere presence of a flamethrower could alter an entire engagement. It forced enemies to rethink positions that once felt unbreakable. It reshaped tactics, shortened brutal stalemates, and revealed how powerful fear could become when it entered confined spaces. In the end, the weapon did more than clear caves. It exposed a deeper truth about the Pacific War, that victory was not always decided by the loudest explosion or the strongest armor, but by the fragile line between endurance and psychological collapse. A simple design, carrying an impact far greater than anyone expected. In the years that followed, countless weapons from the war would be studied for their engineering, their firepower, or their innovation. The M2 Flamethrower was rarely remembered for any of those reasons. It remained, at its core, a simple tool, heavy, dangerous, and carried by soldiers who understood the risk every time they stepped forward. But its true story was never about machinery. It was about what happened inside the minds of those who faced it. Across the Pacific, caves that once symbolized unbreakable defense became places of uncertainty. Fortifications designed to last months could lose their meaning in seconds, not because they were shattered by force, but because the belief in their safety disappeared. The battlefield changed, and with it, the invisible balance between courage and fear. In the end, the weapon didn't just clear terrain. It revealed how fragile even the strongest positions could become when psychological pressure replaced physical distance. And that is why a device so simple left such a lasting shadow over the war, because in the Pacific, fear often moved faster than bullets.